Hi, my name is Chris Freeman. I'm going to be talking to my AP Environmental Science students today about the oxygen sag curve, cultural eutrophication, point source and non-point source pollution, and also some indicator species that can help us understand what's going on in these waterways as it's happening. So let's get right to it. I want to first talk about this image right here that you see. It's sort of a picture, it's sort of a graph, it's sort of a lot of things. So let's unpack this complex thing. So this is the oxygen sag curve. It has, as you can see, on the sort of the front of this is going to be a graph with some different zones. The main focus here is going to be on this dissolved oxygen, DO, capital D, capital O. That's dissolved oxygen. If you ever see DO on the AP Environmental Science test, that's what they're talking about. And 8 parts per million means that we have a lot of happy fish in the water, lots of oxygen in the water. That's important, dissolved oxygen. And as we move down, we see the oxygen drop, and we see a huge spike in this red thing over here. This can be called two things: biological oxygen demand, you can have it called that, or it can be called biochemical oxygen demand. Means the same thing. Basically, it's a relationship between, and it's the potential for dissolved oxygen levels to drop, but it's a relationship between aerobic bacteria and waste, nutrient waste that's getting put into waterways. So when we have a spike in this, is because nutrients are getting added heavily to the water, organic waste, and when that spikes, we have the potential for the carrying capacity to increase because there's more food for aerobic bacteria. And that aerobic bacteria, they breed like crazy, eat like crazy, and that they are going to then draw down and use up all the available dissolved oxygen. So we have these zones here. We have the clean zone. That's going to be upriver from this waste. And we have a lot of happy fish. Notice you see trout, perch, bass. They are indicators of good, lots of dissolved oxygen because they need a lot of oxygen to live. You also have mayflies and stoveflies. They're going to be food for these other critters, but they also need a lot of oxygen to live. So you wouldn't have those organisms. So they can be used as indicators to show, yes, we don't have too much nutrient loading. We have a lot of good things going on. It's a healthy ecosystem. As we get further down river, once we hit where this nutrient loading is occurring for this oxygen sag curve, we have a change in ecosystem, a change in fish that we're seeing. We aren't seeing the happy fish. We aren't seeing the fish that need a lot of oxygen. We're seeing things like carp, gar, catfish, those sorts of things that can sort of live in oxygen-starved environments. Okay, this is a zone of decomposition. So we have a lot of aerobic bacteria that are eating up and helping with decomposition, but they're using up all this oxygen. And then we have no fish really in this septic zone, not many fish at all. You might have some worms. There's two terms that I want you to think about: hypoxia and anoxia. And so hypoxia is when we have essentially no oxygen in the water, and anoxia is when we have very little oxygen left in the water. And so those terms come up on the AP exam from time to time, and that would be associated with this sort of septic zone where you're not going to have many fish. It's going to be a dead zone at that juncture. And then we go a little further downstream, further away from the spill here, and we have oxygen rates starting to recover. Notice the inverse relationship here of we have a spike here of biochemical oxygen demand, and as that's going on, we have a drop in dissolved oxygen. As the dissolved oxygen starts to recover, we see a drop of the BOD. So that's an important relationship. In order to have the oxygen rates recover, we really need to see the BOD drop. So in this zone, we have a recovery zone, and we see trash fish, carp, and gar coming back in. They're still low oxygen fish. And then as our oxygen levels are getting back to 8 parts per million, we're starting to see the mayflies. We're starting to see the trout, the perch, the bass, the stuff that we want to see. So that really explains, hopefully, to your benefit, the oxygen sag curve that's usually associated with riverways. I want to talk about something that really relates to this, but is more of a and here are some indicator species before we jump into cultural eutrophication, I just want to point out in the Chesapeake Bay, where we also have a lot of dead zones, a lot of reduced dissolved oxygen levels, you can use fish in the Chesapeake Bay to identify what the levels are. If we're not seeing blue crabs, there's a problem. We're seeing a drop in dissolved oxygen. Okay, if you're not seeing flounder, then boy, the dissolved oxygen level is even lower. And so you can really think about what fish can I use for an experiment to see. These would be indicator species to get a better sense of what's going on in the Chesapeake Bay, where we have a lot of dead zones. So let's talk about what creates those dead zones. This is in the Gulf of Mexico, okay, but the Chesapeake Bay has similar issues where we have dead zones. And what I'm describing right now is called cultural eutrophication. And so nutrients in the water is totally natural, but humans add so much more nutrients that we cause these devastating effects. Right? Remember, nitrogen should be in the air. That's where 78% of all nitrogen in our atmosphere is stored, and so most of our nitrogen is stored in the atmosphere. Legumes and lightning are what get it into the ground, but humans have started putting more nitrogen and phosphorus on the ground than ever before, and as a result of that, we're getting more nitrogen into our waterways. That's cultural eutrophication, and the ramifications of that are creating a dead zone. So all the green that you see in this huge watershed of the Mississippi River, the breadbasket of the United States, is essentially this watershed is fertilizer and animal waste getting put into the watershed and coming down the Mississippi River and nutrient loading. There's some cities around here too that can add to the nutrient load as well. And what we end up with is a huge algae bloom that will occur out in the Gulf of Mexico. As the algae dies and starts to break down, we'll also have aerobic bacteria that will thrive during this, and they will eat and use up the oxygen. And as a result of that, we get a dead zone. And a dead zone is what you don't want in a waterway, because then you can't have fish, and you have the hypoxia or anoxia living conditions, which would be very harsh. That would be a problem for any ecosystem. So we have point source and non-point source pollution, and keep in mind this happens in the Chesapeake Bay, which also is a very large watershed. But we have a lot of chicken farms on the eastern shore of the Delmarva Peninsula. So you can imagine a lot of the chicken poop is going to be getting into the waterway there. We have some farms from Pennsylvania and New York that are adding to that, along with Virginia. But in Maryland, Delaware, we have a lot of nutrients pouring into the Chesapeake Bay and causing very similar problems. You're also going to see dead zones spike in the summertime because dissolved oxygen, and this is an important point for the AP environmental test, dissolved oxygen, it's harder for it to stay dissolved in warmer waters. So you just have naturally less oxygen in warm water conditions. When the water's cold, it holds onto that dissolved oxygen better. So the nutrient loading plus warmer weather is going to release more dissolved oxygen into the air and get it out of the water. And we need it in the water for fish. So point source pollution is pretty simple. You have a pipe, you can point at it, and you can say, wow, look at that gross stuff coming out of it. Don't want that in a waterway. That's going to be nutrient loading and be causing eutrophication-like issues. But we can also have things like a septic system. In a bunch of septic systems in a neighborhood that might not be on city sewer lines, like Pungo. It's a great example. Most people in Pungo are going to have septic systems. And so we think about these homes as like a connected entity, right? They're all on septic systems, and all their septic systems have leach fields, and we have ammonia coming in the form of urine, and the septic system sort of has bacteria in there which are processing this information or this material. Ammonia is then being converted to nitrite, and then from nitrite to nitrate, and nitrate is what a plant ate. So that's going to be able to get into our water bodies, and that is going to lead to non-point source pollution. We think about a whole neighborhood as being non-point source pollution, and an entire farm field as being non-point source pollution. Car exhaust from all the cars in Virginia Beach is being non-point source pollution. A smokestack from a power plant, point source pollution. A sewage pipe coming out into a waterway, point source pollution. But septic systems, fertilizers from lawns, non-point source pollution. Hope this review helped y'all. Whew.